Everyone, what's up and welcome back to another episode here of the Crushing Small Stakes PLO course. This week we're going to look into a 3-bet pot situation and we're going to learn more about how to play more aggressively and how to find the right balance in a situation where our opponent is checking to us in a 3-bet pot. The situation is button versus small blind. We are sitting on the button. The small blind 3-bets us, we make the call and we go to the flop. This week we're going to look into dynamic straight flops. In this situation, the flop is 7-6-3 two-toned. The small blind did 3-bet as mentioned. He's checking to us on the flop, and the action is on us. The question here is, what are we supposed to do with our range? What sizings are we supposed to use here? What types of hands are we betting for value as well as bluffs? And how should we think about our entire range? When we look into our sizing preferences here, we can see that we are generally leaning towards a 1/3 pot sizing here. I ran a couple of boards with multiple sizings, and what we see is that it's mainly converging towards a 1/3 sizing. So for this episode, I'm going to simplify it to all betting 1/3 on the pot here, which seems to be a fine simplification, where the EV difference is extremely minimal if we use, for example, 2 or 3 sizings here. Also using a different sizing, for example, half pot, the difference in EV is extremely low. For simplification, therefore, 1/3 is what we use here. But in game, feel free to also use sometimes a half pot sizing or maybe something in between. Like there are different ways to go, but here we choose 1/3 pot. The goal is to better understand our stabbing range on the flop. And in the next 2 episodes, we're gonna launch 3 episodes today. This is about flop. But in part 2 and 3, we're going to learn more on how to continue turns as well as rivers after getting check called by the small blind. First things first, here is the breakdown button versus small blind on 7-6-3 two-tone. You can see all the strength buttons here as you are used to, of course. We can see in the dark blue bars, we can see our check back range. And in the light blue bright bars, we can see our stabbing range. From strong to weak, going from left to right. You can take a screenshot of this or pause the video to look deeper into it. I'm not gonna dissect it all. I'm not going to jump into all these strength buckets because I already got a few important takeaways from this for you later in this episode. So for those of you who are interested, take your time, look into it. And for now, we are gonna move on here and look into our next steps here. First things first, when we think about our range here, we want to think about what sizings are we using and how often are we supposed to bet here. When we look at the board here, you can see when checked to in the equity distribution graph on the right side here, you can see how our range is built versus our opponent's range. And you can basically see here that we have an advantage in the top of our range whenever our opponent is checking to us. Remember, he is supposed to have a c-bet frequency here on this board. He's supposed to c-bet around 22% of the time here on this board texture. I also looked into some population tendencies, and this frequency is actually pretty similar to what a lot of people are playing, also at low stakes. Like, it's not the case that people are c-betting these boards extremely often. Some people might think that, but it's not the case. The average c-bet frequency on these low straight boards are anywhere between 25%, maybe a little bit higher, but something like 25 to 30%. So yes, it is a little bit more than what is happening here in the GTO sim, but it is still fine enough here for this situation. We're looking into a situation here where our opponent is checking after he did have a c-bet range, and we can now see that ranges are built this way. We have an advantage in the top of our range here. You can see it here on the left side of the graph. Our opponent is holding an advantage in the middle and bottom part of the range versus range interaction. And that leads to a situation where we want to use a somewhat polarized approach here on the flop. We are obviously betting the strong and best hands in our range here, which is the left part. And then we are betting some of our weakest hands here in the bottom, because these hands, they cannot win after checking back, of course, and we want to bet them to make hands that are in the middle and bottom end of our opponent's range put into a tough situation. By betting small, we can leverage ourselves to bet multiple streets in position, which is obviously a big advantage when we are sitting in position here, and therefore we often go for a polarized approach with a small sizing when the ranges are built this way. As mentioned, we are betting 1/3 pot in this situation. Okay, so far range versus range interaction here. Remember that, guys, it's very important, and always make sure to think about these situations and use these equity graphs whenever possible. Okay, so we're going to look into dynamic straight flops here, the 7-6-3 two-tone. Today, we're betting $4 in this situation. Remember, we're playing PLO 50 here, so 1/3 pot here would be around $4 in a $12 pot. And we're going to look through a couple of hand buckets or strength buckets basically and give you guys an idea of what sort of hands we're betting. Obviously, we're going to start off with the best hands. We're going to bet your best hands as often as possible. I don't think many of you are making any mistakes here, so think about straights, sets, and your best two-pair hands here, of course, with additional equity, like those hands with high equity, a lot of nuttiness, and a lot of potential to dominate your opponents are obviously betting. Not much else to say there. When we think about your second best hands, we want to bet those hands with additional equity. So on a board like this, those are mainly two-pair hands. So for example, a bottom two-pair with a flush draw would be a hand that is good enough to bet, as well as top two-pair with a nut gut shot. And remember that on these boards, like a lot of the bare two pairs without flush draws, without straight draws, without a combination of either, or without strong backup, sometimes with a backdoor flush draw, for example, in combination with strong blockers, like most of these hands are just going to check because these hands don't want to bet and get check raised. So these are some examples that you do want to bet here. In two-pair, when we think about two-pair hands that don't want to bet, as mentioned, we're going to check those without additional equity. So for example, pair two-pair here with an overpair of kings, for example, as well as top two-pair without anything else going on. Those hands are mainly checking here. When we look at board pairs, which is a very important category of hands here, we think about a hand that we have that has a 7, a 6, or a 3. It's a big part of our range also because many of the hands in our range will have a board pair hit on this board. We mainly want to bet hands, first of all, that have high equity. So when I talk about high equity, I mean hands that have a pair plus a nut flush draw, for example, a pair plus a combo draw, let's say flush draw plus straight draw, pair plus open ender and backdoor flush draw. Like those combinations are often betting here because they can deal with a check raise. Bet straight draws with blockers and bad playability when checking back. Let's look at some examples here, what I mean. For example, king 8-6-4 here. We have a middle pair blocker, we have a gutter with the 4-8, and we have the 4 of spades. And I think this is an important category and a group of hands where many of us play too passively. And therefore I'm showing it here, not only because of that, but also it's quite a big of a group of hands in our range. So it's important to find enough aggression with those hands. This hand doesn't have the greatest EV and playability when checking back. It's hard to continue if our opponents start betting on many turns. It's so difficult for our hand to really improve here and to call a lot of turns and river bets when our opponents start firing into us there. So these hands are often going for a bet, and if we get check raised, of course, we're going to fold a hand like this, but the EV of betting is just higher than the EV of checking because our playability and realizability of the equity that we have with this hand is so marginal if we decide to check. So remember, we're stacking multiple blockers here together with the 6. We have the 4-8 of the gutter. They also block some of our opponent's continuing range, of course, as well as the 4 of spades here. Another example here would be top pair with the 7. This time we have the 5 of spades and we have a nut gut shot with the 10-9. I see a lot of people checking back ahead like this as well because they think, well, we don't really want to get check raised and we do have some playability of checking back. But on the other hand, the playability is so marginal. There are so many turns that are difficult for us to continue. And the EV of betting simply outweighs the EV of checking here. Therefore, we rather bet fold a hand like this than check it back. So make sure to find enough aggression with these marginal gut shots that do have a pair blocker, that do have a spade blocker. Like these components together are often a way for us to find enough hands into our stabbing range. And that is one of the reasons what we're doing here. We want to find the hands that we want to stab with and increase our general stabbing frequency on this board so we are able to fire enough often and put our opponents in a tough spot here. Some of the board pair hands are betting if they have valuable blockers. Think about a hand like ace 9-9-3, for example. Here we do have a spade in our hand and we do have a pair of nines, which is blocking some of our opponent's combo draws, as well as that we have future potential on some of the straight runouts that we are blocking. Then that we have future blockers there. For example, if the turn would be an 8 or a 5, we have quite valuable blockers there. We do have some equity, of course. We have a pair of threes, which is not too much, but it's something that we can improve on, of course, to a two-pair hand or trips. And we have the backdoor flush draw here as well. But the EV of checking with a hand like this is extremely marginal, especially also holding the pair in our hand, which makes it more difficult to improve. Another hand, king jack 9-7 here. We have a top pair blocker with a king of spades. Like a very, very marginal hand, but we do have quite important blockers here with the high spade, with the 7, and the EV and playability when checking back is pretty marginal. Okay, so let's look at another group of hands, which is some of the remaining parts in our range here, like very, very marginal hands. We want to bet hands with high equity flush draws. So first of all, we're going to bet most of our strong nut flush draws here. Those hands are often good enough to bet and continue against a check raise. We're betting flush draws with 3 spades and 4 spades here extremely often, and the majority of them, whenever they are somewhat connected to the board, are even continuing versus a check raise. But I don't think most of you will find too much problems there with either high equity flush draws. But this is an important category here and interesting. We're bet folding 55% of our weakest flush draws, and I don't think a lot of people are doing that. Many of us will check back these hands very, very often. Think about hands like queen jack 10-5 with a 10 high flush draw, or ace queen 8 deuce with 8 high flush draw. Like these hands, many of us will check them back and try to realize our equity with the flush draw, but in reality, we have a very, very low flush draw. It's still problematic to continue versus aggression on later streets if we do that. We don't have anything else going on besides the flush draw, so it's a pretty low EV check anyway. But we do have some blockers here with, for example, the 5 in the first hand. We do have the 8 and the deuce in the second hand, which are somewhat connected to the board. We don't really mind to bet fold these hands because the EV is anyway pretty marginal with these hands. And many of these hands go into our stabbing range, and the stab basically outweighs our check back option here. So make sure to find enough of these hands, and it's important to think more critically about it. And I also think that I myself are definitely checking back more of these hands than I should basically. Bet low EV hands with bad playability when checking if you have good blockers. For example, queen, queen, 4 deuce. Here we do have a gut shot with the 4 deuce, and we do have an overpair, but still realizability of equity if we check is extremely marginal, problematic. Think about all the runouts that happen. I mean, how often can you really call a bet then? We do have a pair of queens, but like we're up against a 3-betting range that has a lot of aces and kings. So we are still behind the majority of the time here. So bet folding a hand isn't that problematic. Same as a hand like king, queen, jack 8, for example. Here we have absolutely nothing, but we do have an 8, which is blocking some of our opponent's combo draws and straight draws, as well as the jack of spades here. Okay, so make sure to find these hands and think more critically about it, and be aggressive whenever you have a couple of these components together working in favor of betting. Okay, some of the final notes about flop strategy before we're moving on to turn and river follow-ups. Sizing is mixing here often between 1/3 and half pot. It's possible to use a different set of sizings. Generally, we're leaning towards smaller than half pot, but sometimes you can definitely find a sizing that is half pot or something in between, totally fine. But the preference is generally towards a 1/3 pot sizing. EV difference is extremely minimal when choosing the 1/3 pot versus a half pot sizing, for example. And make sure to widen your stabbing range here enough often. Many hands with any form of blocker value and bad playability and or realizability when checking back is often a good candidate to take a stab with. Remember also in general, players at low stakes are check folding more often than they should, which gives us even more reason to obviously stab a little bit more aggressively than we should. Okay, I hope you find some interesting takeaways here, especially those low EV stabs are important here to find and to add into your stabbing range. And we're now moving on to turn strategy in the following video, where we will learn more about how to continue barreling turn after we did bet the flop and get check called by the small blind. Okay, hope you enjoyed this one, and I see you guys in the next video. Thank you very much.